So our final speaker of the day is Patricia Churchland, and she is asking the interesting and intriguing question, what can science teach us about morality? Of course, leave it to a philosopher to try to say something contentious, right? And in fact, this is something that I think Pat in particular excels at, which is one of the reasons I have often been inspired by her work. And she is well known and acknowledged as the founder of a field called neurophilosophy, and she wrote a book of the same title. And this is essentially the view that to understand the mind, we have to understand the brain. And it's a view that, on occasion, much to the chagrin of some more traditional philosophers of mind, is becoming ever more popular and often challenges some deeply held assumptions about how the mind works. So Pat will no doubt continue this endeavor today, and as she talks about morality in the context of neuroscience. So join me in welcoming Patricia Churchland.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you for having me here. It really is a great, great pleasure. It's always lovely to see snow again, even if it's just, the leftover bits from the winter. And may I just also say that it's been wonderful watching Chris from the time he was a postdoc or a graduate student, I guess, at Wash U, to coming here to Waterloo and to do the really rather remarkable and awesome things that he's doing here. So it's really a great pleasure. I have to confess that for many years, for most really of my professional life, I really not wanted to have anything to do with the subject of morality. And yeah, I think you understand those sorts of reasons. But in the last century, of course, one of the great developments on the part of evolutionary biology was to provide for us models of how it could be that social traits could arise and spread through a population. And those models basically said what it would take for traits of sociability, traits such as mutual defense, cooperation, sharing, and so forth, what it would require for those traits to become dominant in the population, even though there could be cheaters and miscreants and so forth. And that, in a way, was very satisfying, except that those were really just models. And nobody really knew what the genes were. But more particularly, nobody really had the slightest idea of what it could be about the nervous system that might be playing a role in social cognition. Now, within the last decade, so much has changed in that regard. And in particular, I really began to get interested in the neurobiology of social behavior as a result of the voles. Now, many of you will know the story of the voles, but in case you don't, I'll just run through it very quickly. There are a number of species of voles. They're little rodents, kind of like rats, but without tails. And in particular, there are prairie voles and montane voles, and they're very similar morphologically, and in many respects, they differ behaviorally in the following very interesting respect. Prairie voles are very social. If you take some prairie voles and put them together, put them into a cage, they tend to kind of hang out together. They like to be together, they like to be close, and so forth. And if you do the same thing with montane voles, they go their separate ways. Moreover, prairie voles, the males and females, tend to bond for life. The males will protect the females and will protect the nest. For a long time it was thought, a few years, it was thought that they were monogamously bonded. It turns out that they do have less than a monogamous life, and they each have a little bit on the side, and this was determined by doing the genetic analysis. Nevertheless, they do bond for life, and if one of the mates dies, the survivor is often quite depressed, may not find another mate, and so forth. They also both engage in rearing the pups, whereas the montane voles are very different. The female only engages in rearing the pups, and they are what are called promiscuous pair bonders because they don't have that kind of sociability. When the brains were studied to determine whether there was a difference in the brain between these two, what was found was really remarkable. And that was, if you compared the brains of a male prairie vole to a male montane vole, the difference came down to this. In one very specific part of the brain known as the ventral pallidum, in the prairie vole, there is a much higher distribution of receptors for a very simple peptide known as vasopressin. That was it. And in the females, the difference was a high density of receptors for another but very simple peptide known as oxytocin. And you could do the manipulation so that if you block the receptors, you could turn a nice little monogamous pair bonder into a rascal little libertine, and so forth. Now, what really interested me was not so much their sex life, but the fact that there was this sort of domain of sociability, where they like to be together, live in large communities, and have a kind of special bonding. And that suggested to me for the first time a kind of link in the brain itself that might help us to understand the nature of social behavior, and hence the nature of morality. Now, much of what I have today is going to be, as Chris predicted, rather speculative and I expect somewhat controversial. But I'm going to sort of lay out a large picture for you, which you may or may not find appealing. So the opening question then is, what can science teach us about morality? And of course, there are many sciences that can make contributions to this, including ethology, where, as we saw with Keith Holyoke's work this morning, there is some attempt to compare the capacities and the behavior of humans with non-humans. Anthropology, experimental psychology, most recently, of course, neuroeconomics, as it tries to understand something about the principles or the strategies behind various kinds of behavior, such as solving the problem of the prisoner's dilemma. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about some of those, but in part what I am going to do today is somewhat philosophical, in the sense that I'm going to try to take a sort of synoptic overview, maybe synaptic too, a little limbic slip there, and try to give you a sense of how certain problems that have been conceived of as philosophical principles may actually be misconceived. The hypothesis that I'm going to assume is that moral behavior is not unique and a special domain of behavior unto itself, but that it's an instance of practical problem solving in general, but it's problem solving in the social domain. And the second thing that I want to try out is the idea that in our brains, as a matter of actual fact of how we make good social decisions, the is much closer to the ought than has been traditionally believed. And that's sort of going to be the end point towards which most of this talk will be directed. So first I should say a little bit about what do we mean by moral. As with many terms that we talk about in neuroscience or in science generally, we do not, in fact, have a precise definition. For these purposes, though, I like to think that what we say is moral is an instance of a wider category of the social. It's just that the stakes are often higher. So, for example, I think driving while under the influence is a case of taking moral risk, whereas wearing a clown suit to a funeral is probably a failure of etiquette, but it's probably not immoral in the same way because you're not risking someone's life. Notice, of course, by the way, that if you were attending a clown's funeral and it was expected that everybody would wear a clown suit, then you would wear a clown suit. By and large, I think we identify the moral by picking out prototypes. For example, we say that someone who protected Jews during the Second World War in Europe showed moral behavior. Or we say that someone like Nelson Mandela, who promoted peaceful transition in South Africa, was an instance or displayed an instance of moral behavior. But of course, there are many small acts of kindness, generosity, and cheerfulness, and so forth that count. And by and large, we learn many of the prototypes as we grow up and as we learn stories about people who did silly things or people who did wise and good things. Now, one question, of course, that has traditionally been asked, was asked essentially of Socrates, is where do moral principles come from? And there has been, of course, an inclination to think that they come from a divine authority. And the answer to that idea was, in fact, given by Socrates when he was asked, what is it that makes things good? Or when he asked, what is it that makes things good or right? And the rather self-satisfied, arrogant priest, the Euthyphro, said, well, it's what the gods say is right. So that's the classic answer, to which Socrates said, well, Euthyphro, I mean, here he is waiting in jail to be executed. Well, Euthyphro, do the gods say that it's right because it is right, in which case the gods are just a mouthpiece? Or is it right because the gods say it's right? That won't work either, because then any arbitrary thing that a god says is right, such as take your firstborn, boil it up, and feed it to the dogs, would be right. And so Euthyphro backs off. And really nobody has been able, I think, to get beyond that Socratic answer. And of course, the further background difficulty with the appeal to divine authority is that there are many divine authorities, allegedly, and they seem to direct people to different things. There's often a failure of uniformity, but there's also, of course, the failure of epistemology. That is, the knowledge that you are indeed getting information from God has always been difficult to establish. The other great candidate, of course, is reason, and particularly in the 18th century when Kant wanted to argue that morality comes out of the pure will, the pure reason, and I'll have a little bit more to say about Kant later. But third, of course, is moral intuition. You just know. And there is something appealing about the idea of moral intuition. To spell out a little bit more exactly what moral intuition might be, there are a number of different strategies. And I just sort of roughed out two here, but of course this oversimplifies. One takes the view that there are indeed moral principles in the sense of rules, and that they are in some way or other innate. They come along with the rest of the genes. And that there is, as Mark Hauser would say, an innate moral grammar. A rather different response, and I think this is one that I prefer, partly because it fits with what we know about social behavior in the voles, but in other animals as well, is that there is a sort of major impulse to sociability. And that in the relevant ecological conditions, which include the other people, the reward system gets tuned up so that we come to adopt the cultural practices of the group and sometimes even to modify those cultural practices. And where the idea really is that given the background of the social impulses, that is to be together and to like and get on and so forth, that there are issues of practical social problem solving that get solved. And that given the general nature of our problem solving capacities, the way we solve those problems in different cultures can often look quite similar. Not because we are expressing a universal moral grammar, but because our brains have very similar ways of solving similar social problems. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because I want to say a little bit about the idea of rules, especially because I think it's very customary, and I think in my own thinking about these things, it was very natural to think that rules in morality play a fundamental role, that perhaps in contrast to other aspects of our practical life, in the moral domain, rules rule. So in mainstream philosophy, there are really kind of 4 tenets to this idea about the importance of rules. One is that you can't have morality without them. Another is that they are determined essentially by reason, that they are internalized, the rules are internalized by the young as they grow up, and that they are actually used on a case-by-case basis in moral reasoning when we try to decide what to do. And in part, where's my picture of Hume? Oh, there he is. And in part, I think this view, this assumption that rules must be part of the story for morality is owed to the fact that Hume made this observation, that you cannot derive an ought from an is. Now, before I say too much more about rules, I just want to have a slightly closer look at what he means by derive. You cannot derive an ought from an is. So let's just look at 2 obvious instances where you actually have a genuine derivation. If P then Q, P therefore Q. Good old modus ponens. Or a syllogism. All humans have kidneys. Bill is a human, so Bill has a kidney. Those are instances of derivation. Whereas, of course, if I have a patient in front of me and the patient has a whole lot of red welts on arms and legs, and the patient has recently been traipsing around in the woods and it's in the middle of the summer, I am going to infer that in all probability the patient has poison ivy. But that, of course, is not a derivation and it's not a deduction. It's an inference to a probable conclusion. Now, this is also not an instance of a derivation. All humans want A, so all normal humans ought to seek A. And indeed, that is not a valid argument, and it is not a derivation. So, strictly speaking, that is within the bounds of formal symbolic logic, what Hume said is right. You cannot derive an ought from an is. But what I'm going to argue to, as the talk goes on, is that nevertheless, for something short of derivation, you can infer what you ought to do from facts about the case. Just as I can infer what the probable cause is of the red spots from the facts of the case. All right. So, despite Hume's observation, I want to say, okay, yes, that's quite right. Nevertheless, it must be the case that our natures constrain our basic values and how we refine those existing values. And in that context, then, I want to suggest that reasoning, and this is really ideas that I think Paul Thagard and Keith Holyoke and others have explored, reasoning about social practices is probably a constraint satisfaction process where rules, in fact, play very little role. The background drive framework that probably does play a role is, to simplify, twofold. The deepest part of the background drive framework is those impulses to maintain homeostasis and support the 3 Fs, feeding, fleeing, and fighting. And the social drive, wanting to be with conspecifics at least once in a while, supports the 4th F, reproduction. And if you're a very social animal, say unlike a grizzly bear, whose sociability is really confined to mating and then the period of the mother raising the offspring, in very social groups, then it's not just that you come together for reproduction, but the social group itself helps to augment the probability of survival of the individuals in the group. So the philosophical idea that is pervasive and to which I indeed subscribed to for quite a long time is that the facts cannot tell us what ought to be done. That there must be deep background exceptionalist absolute rules that apply unconditionally. This would be Kant's view. And that the rule is the platform from which any other rules or oughts must follow. So what actually is the role for rules? And to answer that question, we have to have some idea, well, what are the rules? Now, for those of you who are happy viewers of the Stephen Colbert Report, you may well remember when the senator from Louisiana, Westmoreland, who was interviewed. And now Westmoreland was interesting because he had been advocating having a stone tablet of the Ten Commandments in the courthouse. So he was interviewed, and he was asked about this, and then Colbert said, "What are the Ten Commandments?" Now, Westmoreland, who believes that we need to live by the Ten Commandments and that they must be the exceptionalist rules that operate in our behavior, should know. He couldn't say what they were.
He needed the tablet.
I guess. So, what are the rules that perhaps it's sometimes suggested that we in fact all operate according to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, up to a point. Right? There's obviously exceptions. If I am an executioner, it doesn't apply. And it doesn't apply under many other conditions also. Don't be a sucker for excessive pity. Or charity begins at home, which of course conflicts with honor thy neighbor as thyself. And from Exodus we have thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Well, what are the rules that people actually live by? Well, certainly we have rules of thumb, and these are some. Don't lie. But of course we always recognize that there might be a condition under which, the wild maniac is at the door of the orphanage asking whether or not you have any red-haired children, and as the good matron, I am going to lie. And there's no red-haired children here, and so forth. So we all know that there have to be conditions under which there are exceptions. So what role do these actually play in reasoning? Now, the matter of exceptions is important because all of the rules of thumb can conflict under a variety of conditions. And that has suggested, as it did to Kant, that there must be yet deeper rules. There must be the deepest rule, the rule, which is a rule that has no exceptions, that applies absolutely and unconditionally. Now, Kant's strategy was actually amazingly clever. His idea was that the rule should be such that it comes out of reason and relies only on the idea of consistency. So it isn't like a rule that says, don't lie. It doesn't tell you anything specific. It essentially just says, take any rule that you're thinking about applying and ask whether or not you can consistently apply that rule to everybody, including yourself. If it passes the consistency test, you're on. If it doesn't, you're not. And what is the consistency test? Well, it's whether or not you could live by that rule if you had to fall under it. So the idea would be that if I had a rule that said everybody should pay taxes except me, then that would be inconsistent because I couldn't live with a rule that says everybody should pay taxes, but I should not pay taxes. Now, many people have been greatly enamored by this sort of meta rule that Kant articulated, but of course it doesn't work. And it doesn't work in a way precisely because it has no moral content. For example, someone might suggest that the following should be a rule: that all anencephalics should be euthanized at birth. And you might say, well, you can't consistently, rationally hold that. Suppose you were an anencephalic. To which someone might well reply, then indeed I should be euthanized at birth. Now, we know that this argument can be used because we know that Nazis used it during the Second World War, when they argued that all Jews should indeed be put to death. Even if you were a Jew, the question was, to which the response was yes. So the point is that people can consistently espouse rules which, on independent grounds, you and I would say are surprisingly not likely to be considered moral rules. So that isn't going to work either. And quite honestly, that's the best candidate, really, for a rule that would come out of, so they say, pure reason. The other strategy, of course, is a strategy that we owe to John Stuart Mill, who thought that it was most important not just to have rules for specific aspects of behavior, but to take consequences into account. To a first approximation, the rule of utilitarianism is to maximize the happiness of everyone. Now, notoriously, there are problems in calculating this and calculating whether, should I take into account with the same weighting both my own children and those of someone completely unknown to me in Sierra Leone? Probably not. And it would be asking too much to expect that to me. Calculating the consequences often is impossible because we have to make a decision under uncertainty, and often we're asked to calculate things of really very different and sometimes incommensurate value. So for a number of reasons, and we can talk about the details of this if you like, the really only other kind of candidate for an exceptionless absolute rule, namely the utilitarian maxim, turned out not to work either. So probably is the hypothesis. Humans typically decide what to do without invoking a universal rule. Now, one of the pieces of evidence, let me just go back for this. One of the pieces of evidence, and I'm not going to say too much about other kinds of evidence here, although we could talk about that, concerns the infamous trolley problem. Now, I'm going to assume that most people here know the trolley problem, but roughly speaking, here it goes. There's two kinds of situations. In one, there's a bus stuck on a track, and there is another track here with only one guy sitting on it. There's 5 people on the bus. I could flip a lever, send the trolley that way, save 5, kill 1. Other story. There is a footbridge. There's a trolley stuck. Out of control car coming down the tracks. I could push a rather portly guy down onto the tracks, and allegedly he would stop this runaway car and save all the guys. Okay. Now, the data on this has always really troubled me. For one thing, it's a very under-described situation. And one question that arises concerns the role of rules, because one interpretation of the results is that most people are willing to pull the lever, which allegedly makes them consequentialists in one case, but in the other case they're not willing to push the portly man, which apparently makes them Kantians. Now, what rule is actually being applied here is my question. So an interesting experiment to kind of muddy the waters, shall we say, was done by David Pizarro and his colleagues, some of which are at Irvine. So here was the way the experiment was done, and it I think, is very revealing about the idea that there are rules that guide the behavior. You get a huge body of undergraduates, ask them to self-report whether they're conservatives or liberals. Put the conservatives aside for a moment. Let's just talk about the liberals. Now we're going to divide the liberals into two groups. And both groups are going to get a story involving my pushing a portly man onto the tracks to stop an out-of-the-way car. But they're going to get different stories about the portly man. Story one. In the trolley are 100 people from the Harlem Jazz Orchestra. Portly man is Chip Ellsworth III. Would you be willing? I pushed him off and saved them. Did I do the right thing? Most liberals say yes. In that group. All right, second story. Trolley contains 100 members of the New York Philharmonic. All right, mostly white guys. Portly man is Tyrone Clayton. Most liberals will not push Tyrone onto the track. Very interesting difference. He also did a set of experiments involving American soldiers in Iraq killing Iraqi innocent bystanders versus Iraqi soldiers in Iraq killing American bystanders. And by and large, the liberals are willing to have the Iraqis kill American bystanders, but not vice versa, whereas conservatives do it just the other way. Now, I'm sure that we're all just like that, right? But what's very interesting about this, I think, is that these are, and this was also not just done with undergraduates, but because they were so surprised by the results, they went out into the community and did it and got the same results. It looks to me like, by and large, there's a whole lot of things that go on in moral decision making, but that probably rules aren't one of them. That very often what happens is that when we're called upon to justify what we did, then post hoc, the rules become relevant. I say, well, charity begins at home when I need to explain why I did something for my family as opposed to something for somebody else. Or if I did something for somebody else as opposed to my family, I say, well, I need to honor my neighbor as myself. And so we pick our rule of thumb according to what we did and our desire, of course, to look reasonable to our fellows. Okay. So the basic thought then, and this just kind of repeats an earlier point, is that evolution sets the brain's basic style of emotions and drives, or values, and that experience then shapes that style into very specific habits and preferences using the reward system. That so-called social wiring then involves the capacity to have pleasure, to take pleasure, and to feel pain as a result of social interactions. So we feel pleasure in giving food to offspring. And in fact, we know, for example, that when a mother is nursing an infant, that there's a big flood of oxytocin in the brain, both of the mother and of the infant. It just feels wonderful. And you just think that infant, no matter how red and wrinkled and all the rest of it is, you just think it's the most beautiful thing imaginable. That's just oxytocin speaking, and a good thing too, but that's what it is. And we feel, as dogs do, as gorillas, chimpanzees do, we feel pained when we are shunned, when we are ostracized, when we are excluded. We feel pleasure in grooming, or in the human case, in chatting. and we feel pleasure in being groomed. And again, almost certainly there is lots and lots of oxytocin going on in those circumstances. We feel pain if we are subject to a variety of kinds of disapproval for failing to observe the cultural practices. Now, all this is in keeping actually with Hume, but the person who really, I think, most deeply understood these things was in fact Aristotle, who called us zoon politikon, the political animal. And he really viewed morality as a kind of practical problem, a problem of how to deal with certain kinds of conflicts, how to resolve those conflicts, how to deal with somebody who causes problems or difficulties with the group. And he realized also that there are better and worse solutions, and that sometimes those solutions are going to depend on the history of the group and how the group has functioned in the past, but also on the habits and the cultural practices of varying groups. To update Aristotle a little bit, I think what we would say now is that values are rooted in basic human biology, and that habit formation, and Aristotle was very keen to recognize that it's the development of habits, appropriate habits, not just of etiquette, but of social appropriateness in general, that gets us through life. That habit formation builds on those basic values. Local cultural practices come via learning and via the role of the reward system to feel right. And I suspect, this is very speculative, even more so than the rest of this talk, that part of what happens is that because there is such tight bonding within a group, we really care about are the members of the group, not just the immediate family in many cases, but we're very tightly bonded in many cases to individuals beyond the family. That the cultural practices come to seem absolute and absolutely correct. And that even if they conflict with the cultural practices of some other group, they just, wear their bone through their nose in a different way. It seems horrible to us, or it seems ugly to us. It seems that they are the other and we are the in-group. And so I think one of the great strengths, of course, of this pattern of socialization is that we do have tight bonding. We are willing to defend against attackers, but it also means that we often show great hostility to members of the outgroup. Local cultural practices then are going to also be related to local conditions. You aren't going to see the same cultural practices amongst South Sea Islanders that you see among the Inuit. They also relate to particular accidents of history. So we are going to expect to see in social cognition a role for reward structures and structures involving the emotions like the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, the septum, the hypothalamus, and the basal ganglia. And of course, there'll be a very important role for a whole range of neurochemicals, including, but this is not the exhaustive list, endorphins and certainly oxytocin, vasopressin, cortisol, serotonin, dopamine, and so on. Does this mean then that what is desired is desirable? This is usually the obstacle that we confront if we take the idea that human values are part of our nature and that we build on this. Probably the desired isn't in any simple, obvious way the desirable, but it must be related to it. But it's not a simple relationship because, of course, there are conflicting goals, both within an individual and across individuals within a group. And because there are goals that are short-term goals and there are goals that are long-term goals, or desires that are long-term desires. And also because sometimes as an individual we have ignorance about the future. Some people will know more than we know about it, so the accumulation of evidence can do something like change our desires, or our desires can change over time simply as a result of maturation. What you want and think is terribly and unbelievably important at 14 seems really kind of uninteresting by the time that you're 40. Nevertheless, even though there is no simple equation between what's desired and what's desirable can't be independent of what humans desire, what we do actually want. And what our brains care about fundamentally does shape our ought space, the ought space that we inhabit and within which we make decisions. And this is going to be reflected in our institutions, our policies, and our daily social behavior. So it is claimed that we can't infer what is valuable from the facts, that we must have a normative premise. So how then are we going to deal with that? What is the relation between what is the case and what ought to be the case, what we ought to do? And here what I want to do is to develop an analogy between how we reason in the scientific domain, and I gave you an example earlier of reasoning from knowledge of the red spots and how precisely they looked, and knowing about poison ivy, reasoning from that to a conclusion. It's an inference. I want to draw an analogy between that kind of inference and reasoning to what we ought to do. Okay, so how does human problem solving in the practical domain, what ought I to do, how does it actually work? And here it seems to me that we do use analogical processes, although they may not always be of the sophisticated kind that Keith was talking about this morning. Maybe they're fairly often quite low level, and I'll give you some examples. And constraint satisfaction. I view moral problems in general as constraint satisfaction problems. Of course, the background is that they must involve pattern recognition. We must see a moral situation as an instance of a type. This is like thus and such. In this case, this is an unusual instance of stealing, I guess. So the emotions, and this is really a Damasio point, which I don't think I ever really appreciated until I talked to Tony about the role of the emotions in reasoning itself. He sees the emotions and the habits and all this background oomph as playing a role in determining which prototype you're going to settle on as the best match, because of course there could be many, many. And which story this case is most like. So, for example, the Twin Towers are hit. Which prototype is that most? What is going on? What is this like, we ask ourselves. Now, two, which certainly occurred to people, but as someone pointed out to me, there are, of course, others. Is it more like Pearl Harbor, which, of course, certain people in the White House thought? Or is it more like the Oklahoma bombing, a case of young men full of fervor and nonsense ran amok? Which you choose is not going to be determined in a deductive or derivative way by any background principles you have. It's going to be a constraint satisfaction problem. The other thing that I want to say, so the prototypes and pattern recognition are part of the story. The other part of the story is that I think representations are usually valenced. And Terry mentioned Paul Glimcher's work in that context this morning, where we saw, even at the cellular level, that despite the fact that the stimulus changes, if you get the reward, the response of the cell will actually change as a function of whether the reward is small or not. The stimulus remains the same, but the background fact of the reward is changing the response. And I think in general, representations are valenced. By and large, people feel a kind of positive thing about ice cream, a slightly negative thing about a hornet, and I at least feel quite negative things about poison ivy, if you recognize it. Right? But you do have to recognize it. I think the separation of fact from value, which we all take as kind of fundamental, is probably in fact a late developing and really quite sophisticated move where, for example, when we want to look at our scientific data dispassionately, we actually have to work to separate out those feelings, however strong, that we might want to bring to bear on it. Separating fact from value is actually sophisticated and hard. So I said I wanted to draw an analogy then between scientific explanations where we make an inference to the best explanation, as for example in diagnosing the rash. We make an inference to the best explanation. It's not a deduction from first principles. There's almost no instance in science, with the possible exception of the relation between the laws of statistical mechanics and the heat laws. There's almost no instance of a deduction. It's all abduction, as Peirce called it. It's all inference to a good explanation relative to the background information that we have. As an inference, it's only probabilistic. It's something that we can then test further, or if we have time constraints, which we act on. Analogical reasoning, at least of the kind that I have in mind here, is very simple. Roughly that this case is like B, and in B, when I did X, things worked out pretty well. So B, it's going to be a pretty good choice in this case too. Now, in science then, what we count as the best explanations, that abductive inference, is relative to our background understanding. So these red itchy spots resemble cases of poison ivy I've seen in the past. You were recently walking in the woods, so in all probability, this is poison ivy. Of course, no two cases of poison ivy are identical, not even in the same individual. They look different. And those little kind of rumply welts can look quite different from one person to the next. It's always an inference to the best explanation. And I think we do the same things in making decisions. What we count as the best decisions, that is, what I ought to do given the facts, is relative to our background understanding. We say things like, polio is a really nasty disease. It can be prevented with the following vaccine, so I ought to give the vaccine to my children. I don't deduce it from an exceptionalist rule. I don't say, I don't go back to Kantian absolute first principles and deduce it from that. So practical reasoning, of which I think social reasoning is one instance and moral reasoning is even a smaller domain confined within that, is just like scientific decision making, except it's inference to the best decision, what one ought to do. Now there are some differences, I think, between scientific inferences and practical inferences. The main one being, I think, that in science we typically have what you might call common currency, so that between two hypotheses we can agree that there's a particular measurement that will decide it, and that's the common currency. But in the practical domain, because I think we sometimes, for reasons of individual differences that we're born with or that we acquire or whatever, or even because of conflicting goals in ourselves, we have incommensurate values. So that I might want to build, I might want to buy a kayak. I'm going to have to trade off speed against stability. If I get a really, really skinny kayak, I can go like the Dickens. On the other hand, I may well get tipped over. So it's always a trade-off. And those are kind of different values. And there isn't, in the same way, a common currency. Or to take an example where the incommensurability is even more stark. I might want to build a house, and there are considerations of, say, stability relative to where I'm building versus aesthetic considerations. Two very different things, and ultimately, it's not that there's going to be any exceptionless rules from which I can derive a conclusion about what I ought to do. My brain is simply going to have to settle into a decision. So the hypothesis is that there are many reasonable and wise decisions which do not emerge from rules, that most decisions are not the outcome of deduction, but probably instances of abduction, where we go with what the facts are and some general sense of what we want and where we're going. And many decisions involve evidence accumulation and analogy. So what then is the relation between what is and what we ought to do? What is if the old is ought dogma isn't correct, with what can we replace it? I don't think that we really have an answer, and we'll just have to know an awful lot more about decision making in the brain to get an answer. But I think, roughly speaking, it's that there's a complex current of feelings and desires and memory, background attitudes, as was demonstrated by the Pizarro result, background temperament, personality, and time constraints, because often practical decisions are made within quite restrictive time constraints. And somehow that all works together to land us into an ought minimum. And the rules are rules of thumb that we sometimes find handy when we're teaching kids. Don't lie. But of course, eventually we teach them it's okay to lie. It was okay for Mr. Brown to lie because he saved the whole orphanage, and so forth. And that's how children acquire judgment. It's to see when an exception is a reasonable and fair-minded thing to do. It's not actually by appeal to a deeper exceptionalist rule. So that's the basic story. Thanks.